The year is 1942 and London trembles under the shadow of war. In the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, where electric lights burn day and night and the air tastes of stale tobacco and anxiety, a man in his late 60s moves through corridors that smell of damp concrete and strong tea. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, bears the weight of an empire on his shoulders, and tonight his face shows every ounce of that burden. His physician, a careful man with intelligent eyes named Charles Wilson, watches him closely, noting the pallor, the slight tremor in those famous hands, the way breath comes harder after climbing even a short flight of stairs. The doctor says nothing yet, but his mind catalogues symptoms with clinical precision. Outside these walls, a nation believes their leader is invincible, a bulldog of defiance who will never surrender. If you want to understand how that myth was carefully constructed and maintained, how truth and necessity danced an intricate waltz through the darkest days of the 20th century, then subscribe now, because this story reveals what really happened behind the curtain of wartime secrecy, and it matters more than you might think. The relationship between Winston Churchill and Lord Moran, as Charles Wilson became known after his elevation to the peerage in 1943, forms one of the most fascinating and controversial medical partnerships in modern history. Wilson had been appointed Churchill's personal physician in May 1940 after the Dunkirk evacuation, recommended by Brendan Bracken, Churchill's friend and advisor. Wilson was then 58 years old, president of the Royal College of Physicians, a distinguished veteran of the First World War, who had written about courage and fear in combat with unusual psychological insight. He understood that leadership under extreme stress exacted a physical price, and he recognized immediately that his new patient was both extraordinarily resilient and dangerously vulnerable. Churchill drove himself relentlessly, sleeping little, drinking considerably, smoking cigars constantly, working through the night, traveling to war zones despite his age, and maintaining a schedule that would exhaust men half his years. Wilson's task was not simply to treat illness when it arose, but to manage the health of a man who refused to acknowledge his own mortality, a man whose country needed him to project strength even when his body betrayed weakness. The first serious medical crisis occurred in December 1941, shortly after Churchill had traveled to Washington to meet President Roosevelt following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The journey itself had been arduous, crossing the Atlantic in winter aboard the battleship Duke of York, and upon arrival, Churchill threw himself into intense negotiations and speeches that would shape the Anglo-American alliance. On the night of December 26th, after opening a window in his overheated room at the White House, Churchill experienced sharp pains in his chest that radiated down his left arm. He struggled to breathe. He felt a sensation of tightness, of constriction, that frightened him despite his habitual dismissal of personal danger. Wilson examined him carefully and concluded that Churchill had suffered a coronary insufficiency, what we would now recognize as a mild myocardial infarction, a heart attack. The doctor faced an impossible choice. Standard medical practice demanded complete rest for at least 6 weeks, but Churchill was in the middle of vital wartime negotiations, and the United States had just entered the war. To reveal that the British Prime Minister had suffered a heart attack would send shockwaves through Allied morale and give comfort to the Axis powers. Wilson made a decision that would haunt ethical debates for decades. He said nothing. He did not inform President Roosevelt or American physicians. He did not insist Churchill stop working. He administered a tablet of morphine and watched his patient carefully, knowing that another attack might prove fatal, knowing that his silence placed duty to the state above strict medical ethics. Churchill continued his American visit, delivering his famous address to Congress on December 26th despite chest pains, traveling to Canada, conducting negotiations, and only returning to Britain in mid-January 1942. Wilson noted in his private diary that he had diagnosed coronary thrombosis, but had kept this knowledge from everyone except himself. The doctor reasoned that telling Churchill the full truth would alarm him unnecessarily, and that the Prime Minister would ignore advice to rest regardless. More importantly, Wilson believed that public revelation would damage the war effort at a critical moment. This was not mere medical paternalism, but a calculated judgment about wartime necessity. The British government and Parliament received no detailed medical bulletins during this period. Churchill's brief absences were attributed to his demanding travel schedule and workload, which was true enough. The public saw newsreels of their leader looking tired but determined, and no whispers of cardiac crisis reached the newspapers, which operated under strict wartime censorship guidelines administered by the Ministry of Information. The machinery of wartime secrecy operated with ruthless efficiency. The Ministry of Information, led initially by Duff Cooper and later by Brendan Bracken, worked closely with newspaper editors and the BBC to ensure that information about the Prime Minister's health remained vague and reassuring. This was not simply government diktat, but reflected a shared understanding among the political class and media that certain information could genuinely endanger national security. German intelligence monitored British press reports obsessively, searching for any signs of weakness or division. A revelation that Churchill had suffered a heart attack would have been analyzed exhaustively in Berlin and Tokyo, potentially affecting enemy strategic calculations. The practice of medical bulletins for important figures had long traditions in British public life, but these bulletins were crafted carefully, balancing truthfulness with discretion. When Churchill fell ill, which happened periodically throughout the war years, the announcement spoke of fatigue, colds, or minor ailments requiring brief rest. These statements were not technically false, but they omitted crucial context and severity. The War Cabinet, consisting of Churchill and a small group of senior ministers, operated in an atmosphere of intense pressure and mutual dependence. Members included Clement Attlee as Deputy Prime Minister, Anthony Eden at the Foreign Office, and others who shared collective responsibility for prosecuting the war. They worked together in the underground cabinet war rooms and at 10 Downing Street, meeting daily or even multiple times daily during crises. These men noticed when Churchill looked unwell, when his legendary energy flagged, when he seemed to struggle with the physical demands of leadership. But direct questions about his health were rare. The culture of the British establishment prized discretion and avoided intrusive personal inquiries. Moreover, no one wanted to contemplate the implications of Churchill being seriously incapacitated. There was no formal succession plan, no clear mechanism for replacing a prime minister during wartime beyond a vote in Parliament, and Churchill's unique relationship with both the British public and Allied leaders made him seem irreplaceable. The very idea of telling Parliament or the public that their wartime leader had suffered a heart attack seemed unthinkable, not because anyone consciously decided on a cover-up, but because the default setting was silence about medical matters unless absolutely necessary. Lord Moran accompanied Churchill on his extensive wartime travels, which took them to North Africa, the Soviet Union, Italy, France, and back to North America multiple times. These journeys involved long flights in unpressurized aircraft, exhausting schedules, exposure to extreme weather, and constant stress. In December 1943, Churchill traveled to North Africa for conferences in Cairo and Tehran, meeting with Roosevelt and Stalin to plan the final stages of the war against Nazi Germany. The journey continued to Tunisia, where Churchill intended to visit troops and inspect military operations. On December 15th, he fell seriously ill with pneumonia at Carthage, suffering from high fever, severe cough, and difficulty breathing. This was bacterial pneumonia, potentially life-threatening for a man of 69 with a history of cardiac problems. Moran summoned specialist physicians, including Dr. Bedford, a heart expert, and nurses to provide round-the-clock care. The illness was severe enough that Churchill's daughter Sarah, who had accompanied him as an aide, later recalled fearing for her father's life. Treatment included the newly available sulfur drugs and careful monitoring. This time, medical bulletins could not be entirely suppressed because Churchill's absence from public view stretched for weeks, and the International Press Corps in North Africa noticed the suddenly restricted access to the Prime Minister. The British government released carefully worded statements, acknowledging that Churchill was suffering from pneumonia and required rest, but minimizing the severity. Newspapers reported the illness, but reassured readers that recovery was progressing well. The full gravity of the situation, including concerns about cardiac complications, remained hidden. Moran's medical decisions during this crisis balanced aggressive treatment with the understanding that his patient would insist on resuming work as soon as physically possible. Churchill did indeed recover, though the illness left him weakened. By early January 1944, he was well enough to travel, though Moran knew the pneumonia had taken a significant toll on an already strained constitution. Parliament received general updates, but no detailed medical analysis, and members did not press for more information, accepting the official narrative that their Prime Minister had suffered a bout of pneumonia but was recovering satisfactorily. Another bout of pneumonia struck Churchill in the summer of 1944, following the successful D-Day landings. Once again, Moran treated the infection with antibiotics and enforced what rest he could upon a patient who chafed at inactivity. The pattern repeated: illness, treatment, carefully managed information, and rapid return to public duties. The cumulative effect of these episodes worried Moran deeply, but he found himself in an impossible position. He could not force Churchill to retire or even to moderate his workload substantially. The Prime Minister considered the war his personal responsibility and refused to acknowledge physical limitations. Moran could only mitigate risks where possible, treat problems as they arose, and hope that Churchill's formidable will would carry him through to victory. The doctor's private diaries filled with observations about his patient's health, his habits, his resilience, and his vulnerabilities. These notes would later become the basis for a book that sparked enormous controversy, but during the war years they remained strictly confidential, known only to Moran himself. An important clarification must be made here, because popular accounts often conflate different medical events and create confusion about what actually happened during the war years versus what occurred afterward. Winston Churchill did not suffer strokes during World War II. The heart attack in 1941 and the pneumonia episodes in 1943 and 44 were serious enough, but they were not cerebrovascular accidents. Churchill's first documented stroke occurred in August 1949, 4 years after the war ended, and while he was leader of the opposition rather than Prime Minister. This was a relatively minor stroke affecting his speech and movement temporarily, from which he recovered substantially. The second and much more serious stroke happened in June 1953, when Churchill was serving his second term as Prime Minister at the age of 78. This stroke left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly for several days. The fact that Churchill suffered no strokes during the war itself is medically significant and historically important, yet the myth of wartime strokes persists in popular imagination, perhaps because his other health crises were serious enough that strokes seem like a natural addition to the list, or perhaps because the secrecy surrounding his health in general created an atmosphere where any rumor seemed plausible. The stroke of June 1953 deserves detailed examination because it demonstrates how the machinery of official secrecy continued to operate even after the war, and because the ethical questions it raises about public disclosure remain relevant. On June 23rd, Churchill suffered a major stroke at 10 Downing Street following a dinner for the Italian Prime Minister. He lost the ability to move his left side and struggled to speak. Moran was summoned immediately and recognized the severity of the situation. Over the following days, as Churchill lay partially paralyzed and unable to perform his duties, a small group of ministers, doctors, and staff orchestrated one of the most successful cover-ups in modern British political history. Cabinet meetings were cancelled with vague explanations. A scheduled speech was postponed, citing fatigue. The official line presented to Parliament and press was that the Prime Minister needed rest due to exhaustion and strain. No medical bulletin mentioned a stroke. No announcement acknowledged that Churchill was temporarily incapacitated. The government continued to function with senior ministers, particularly Acting Foreign Secretary Rab Butler and Commonwealth Secretary Lord Salisbury, managing affairs while maintaining the fiction that Churchill remained in charge. The press cooperated fully with this deception. Newspaper editors were privately briefed on the situation and agreed not to publish the truth, accepting the argument that doing so would create political instability and international uncertainty during the Cold War. This was not legal censorship, as wartime restrictions had ended, but voluntary restraint based on appeals to patriotism and political stability. The fact that all major newspapers independently chose silence speaks to the continuing power of establishment conventions in 1950s Britain. Members of Parliament asked questions about Churchill's absence and received bland reassurances. Some suspected the truth, but without press confirmation or official admission, rumours remained speculation. Churchill's recovery was slow but sufficient that by early August he was able to make limited public appearances, though his movement remained impaired and his speech sometimes slurred. By October, he had recovered enough to attend the Conservative Party conference and deliver a speech that demonstrated he retained his mental faculties, even if his physical condition had deteriorated. The official story evolved to acknowledge that Churchill had suffered what was termed a disturbance of the cerebral circulation, a euphemism for stroke, but only after he had already substantially recovered and the immediate crisis had passed. This 1953 episode raises profound questions about democratic accountability and the right of citizens to know about the health of their leaders. Unlike the wartime situation, where genuine national security concerns could justify exceptional secrecy, this occurred during peacetime when normal constitutional processes should have applied. Britain had no formal mechanism for determining whether a prime minister was fit to serve, relying instead on the judgment of the prime minister himself, his cabinet colleagues, and ultimately Parliament through a confidence vote. But Parliament cannot make informed judgments without accurate information. By concealing the stroke, Churchill's inner circle effectively usurped the constitutional function of Parliament to hold the executive accountable. They made a decision that Churchill should remain Prime Minister despite being temporarily unable to perform his duties, and they made that decision without consulting the broader cabinet, let alone Parliament or the public. Their justification was that Churchill would recover sufficiently, and that revealing his incapacity would damage Britain's international standing during tense Cold War years. But this placed their political judgment above constitutional principle, setting a precedent that leaders could hide serious illness if they deemed it in the national interest. Lord Moran's role throughout these episodes demands careful assessment. As Churchill's physician for 15 years, from 1940 to 1955, Moran witnessed his patient at his strongest and most vulnerable. The doctor clearly admired Churchill and considered him a great man, but he also saw the physical and mental toll that power exacted. Moran's decision to remain silent about the 1941 heart attack was made in wartime circumstances that most would acknowledge as exceptional. His treatment of Churchill during the pneumonia episodes showed medical skill and dedication, but his continuing participation in the cover-up of the 1953 stroke, when the war was long over, raises more troubling questions about whether his loyalty to his patient and to political stability overrode his medical ethics and his duty to broader constitutional principles. Doctors face genuine dilemmas when treating powerful patients. Patient confidentiality is a fundamental medical principle, yet when the patient is a head of government, whose health affects millions, the normal rules seem inadequate. Moran appears to have resolved this dilemma by placing national interest as he understood it above strict confidentiality, willing to keep secrets from the public, but also willing to make detailed records that might eventually inform historical understanding. The publication of Lord Moran's memoir, titled Churchill, The Struggle for Survival, in 1966 caused a sensation and a scandal. The book appeared 3 years after Churchill's retirement and the same year as his death, drawing on Moran's detailed diaries to reveal the medical history that had been so carefully concealed. The Royal College of Physicians condemned Moran for breaching patient confidentiality, and many of Churchill's family and friends expressed outrage that such private medical details had been made public. Critics argued that doctors who treat powerful patients must maintain absolute silence even after death, that the relationship of trust between physician and patient is sacred and cannot be violated for commercial gain or historical interest. The controversy damaged Moran's reputation in medical circles and among the establishment figures who had cooperated in maintaining Churchill's mystique. But others defended Moran's decision, arguing that Churchill was not merely a patient, but a historical figure whose health decisions affected world events, and that the public had a right to understand how those decisions were made and what physical conditions shaped them. The debate continues today. Medical ethics committees and historians still argue about whether Moran betrayed his patient or fulfilled a duty to historical truth. The revelations in Moran's book fundamentally changed understanding of Churchill's wartime leadership. Readers learned for the first time about the 1941 heart attack, the severity of the pneumonia episodes, the constant medical vigilance required to keep Churchill functioning, and the deliberate decisions to conceal information from cabinet, parliament, and public. This knowledge complicated the heroic narrative of Churchill as the indomitable leader who never wavered. It revealed him as human, vulnerable, sick at times, continuing to lead despite physical suffering that might have forced other men to step aside. Some found this humanizing and even more admirable, suggesting that Churchill's greatness lay partly in his refusal to surrender to bodily weakness. Others felt betrayed by the secrecy, arguing that the British people had been misled about the health of their leader at the most critical period in their history. The debate reflects broader tensions between wartime necessity and democratic principle, between the need for leaders to project strength and the right of citizens to make informed choices about who leads them. The question of what Parliament actually knew during the war years can now be answered with reasonable precision, thanks to Moran's revelations and subsequent historical research. Parliament knew that Churchill worked extremely hard, travelled constantly, and periodically fell ill with what were described as minor ailments or fatigue requiring brief rest. Members of Parliament read the same medical bulletins as the public, carefully worded statements that acknowledged illness but minimized severity. Some MPs certainly suspected that Churchill's health was more precarious than official statements suggested. His appearance occasionally showed the strain he was under, and observers noted weight fluctuations, pallor, and signs of exhaustion. But suspicion is not knowledge, and without confirmation from medical sources or government admission, Parliament had no basis for formal action. The War Cabinet knew more than rank-and-file MPs because they saw Churchill daily and noticed when he struggled, but even War Cabinet members were not given full medical details by Moran. The inner circle that knew the complete truth during the war years consisted of Moran himself, possibly one or two other consulting physicians, Churchill's immediate family when they were present, and perhaps a very small number of the closest personal staff. This circle maintained silence not through formal conspiracy, but through shared understanding that such information could not be revealed without potentially catastrophic consequences for morale and the war effort. The mechanisms by which this secrecy was maintained deserve examination because they reveal how power operates in democratic systems under stress. The Ministry of Information's relationship with the press was crucial. During wartime, the ministry had legal authority under the defense regulations to suppress information deemed harmful to national security, but it rarely needed to use formal censorship because editors voluntarily complied with requests. A system of private briefings and gentlemen's agreements meant that editors knew more than they published and chose restraint. This system worked because editors were typically drawn from the same social class and educational background as government ministers, shared assumptions about national interest and valued their access to inside information. The BBC operated under even tighter government influence, with its Director General appointed by the government and a clear understanding that broadcasting should support the war effort. When Churchill fell ill, the BBC simply avoided detailed health reporting, focusing instead on his speeches and public appearances when he recovered. The system extended to Parliament itself, where party whips and senior members maintained informal channels of communication with the government and helped manage awkward questions, ensuring that health inquiries did not escalate into formal challenges to Churchill's fitness to serve. International dimensions also mattered. Britain's allies and enemies both monitored Churchill's health closely because his leadership was central to Allied strategy. President Roosevelt's administration received more detailed information than was given to the British public, though even the Americans were not told everything. When Churchill visited Washington in 1941 and suffered his heart attack, Moran's silence meant that American officials had no idea their guest had experienced a potentially fatal medical crisis. This deception extended to Stalin and the Soviet government, with whom Churchill negotiated at Tehran and Yalta, despite his health problems. The dynamics of the Grand Alliance depended partly on personal relationships among the big three leaders, and revelation that Churchill was seriously ill might have affected Soviet calculations about post-war settlements. German intelligence services actively sought information about Churchill's health, hoping to find evidence of weakness that might affect British resolve or create opportunities for propaganda. The fact that they apparently never learned about the 1941 heart attack or the full severity of later illnesses suggests that operational security around Churchill's medical condition was highly effective, kept within such a tight circle that even normal intelligence penetration of British institutions did not compromise it. The ethical framework within which these decisions were made reflected values and assumptions that seem both familiar and foreign when viewed from the 21st century. British public culture in the 1940s maintained strong boundaries between private and public life, even for political figures. Personal matters, including health, were considered private unless the individual chose to make them public, and prying into such matters was seen as vulgar and inappropriate. This cultural norm reinforced official secrecy, making it easier to argue that Churchill's medical details were nobody's business but his own. At the same time, the wartime context created genuine moral weight for the argument that revealing weakness would aid the enemy. Germany and Japan were totalitarian powers whose propaganda emphasized the decadence and vulnerability of democratic societies. Evidence that Britain's leader was old and sick would have been exploited relentlessly in broadcasts and publications aimed at neutral countries and occupied populations. The pragmatic calculation that maintaining morale and denying the enemy propaganda opportunities justified deception carried real force in circumstances where defeat meant Nazi domination of Europe. Yet even granting the exceptional circumstances of total war, questions remain. Democratic government rests on informed consent and accountability. Citizens delegate power to elected leaders with the understanding that those leaders can be held responsible for their actions and removed if they fail or become unfit. When information necessary for informed judgment is systematically withheld, the democratic process is compromised even if the intentions are good, and the immediate results seem to justify the secrecy. The British constitutional system had no formal way to determine prime ministerial fitness. Unlike some other democracies, there was no procedure for medical evaluation of leaders, no requirement for health disclosures, no clear succession mechanism beyond resignation or death. This absence reflected a culture that trusted individual judgment and informal processes over formal rules, assuming that a prime minister who could not perform duties would recognize this and step aside voluntarily, or that cabinet colleagues would pressure him to do so. Churchill's refusal to acknowledge physical limitations and his cabinet's reluctance to challenge him revealed the weakness of this system when dealing with a strong personality in exceptional circumstances. The contrast with Churchill's peacetime stroke in 1953 illuminates these tensions even more sharply. By that point, the existential threat of war had passed. Britain faced challenges including economic difficulty, colonial unrest, and Cold War tensions, but these were not immediate survival crises justifying the suspension of normal constitutional processes. Yet the same pattern of secrecy prevailed, suggesting that the wartime precedent had created expectations and mechanisms that continued beyond their original justification. Churchill's doctors and close advisors made decisions about concealment based partly on their judgment that he would recover sufficiently, partly on desire to avoid political instability, and partly perhaps on loyalty to a man who had led Britain through its darkest hour. The press cooperated not because they feared censorship, but because editors still accepted the argument that revelation would harm the national interest. Parliament remained ignorant because no one with direct knowledge chose to inform them. The system worked in the narrow sense that Churchill did recover and Britain avoided a political crisis, but it worked by circumventing constitutional principle and denying Parliament and public the information needed to make autonomous judgments. Lord Moran's later publication can be understood partly as an attempt to correct the record and allow historical understanding, even if contemporary disclosure was impossible. His diaries show a man torn between loyalty to his patient and awareness that the decisions being made around Churchill's health had broader implications that deserved documentation. By publishing after Churchill's death, Moran ensured that the historical record would eventually include the truth, even though contemporary audiences were kept in ignorance. This might be seen as a compromise between medical confidentiality and historical responsibility, though it satisfied neither those who believed patient privacy should be absolute nor those who believed the public had a right to know immediately. The fierce criticism Moran faced from the medical establishment suggests that many doctors felt he had betrayed fundamental professional ethics, regardless of his motives or the historical interest in his revelations. Yet historians and biographers have generally been grateful for Moran's detailed records, which provide insights into Churchill's personality and health that would otherwise have been lost. The broader implications of Churchill's medical history and its concealment extend beyond one man and one historical period. Modern democracies continue to struggle with questions about leader health disclosure. Different countries have adopted different approaches, from formal medical examinations and required publication of results to continued reliance on voluntary disclosure and informal norms. The United States, for example, has a constitutional mechanism in the 25th Amendment for removing a president who is unable to discharge duties, but applying it requires judgments and procedures that remain controversial and largely untested. Other democracies rely on coalition partners, parliamentary votes or party processes to address leadership incapacity. But all systems depend ultimately on information, and information about health remains peculiarly difficult to handle because of the strong cultural norm of medical privacy. Leaders have incentives to conceal weakness. Doctors treating leaders face conflicts between patient confidentiality and public interest. Political rivals have incentives to exaggerate health problems for partisan advantage. Media must balance public interest against privacy and avoid speculation based on incomplete information. Winston Churchill's case is particularly instructive because it demonstrates both the elasticity of democratic norms under pressure and the ultimate resilience of truth over time. In the short term, wartime urgency and cultural assumptions about privacy enabled extensive concealment of serious medical problems. The circle of knowledge was kept extremely tight. Official statements were carefully crafted to avoid outright lies while omitting crucial context. The press cooperated in maintaining the desired narrative. Parliament was kept in the dark. The public believed what they were told. The system functioned to protect what those in power believed was the national interest, and in the narrow sense it succeeded because Churchill remained Prime Minister throughout the war, and Britain emerged victorious. But in the longer term, the truth came out through Moran's publications and subsequent research. Historians now have a clear picture of Churchill's health struggles and can assess how those struggles affected his decision-making and leadership. The revelation has not diminished Churchill's historical stature. If anything, it has made his achievements seem more impressive by showing that he continued to lead despite physical suffering and medical crises that might have incapacitated lesser figures. The relationship between physical health and leadership quality remains complex and contested. Some argue that serious illness impairs judgment and that voters deserve to know when leaders are struggling with medical problems that might affect their performance. Others contend that physical health and mental acuity are not directly correlated, that someone can be physically weak, yet mentally sharp, and that focusing on health can be a way of discriminating against older leaders or those with disabilities. Churchill himself would likely have argued that his mind remained clear throughout his health crises and that he was therefore fit to continue leading regardless of physical symptoms. Moran's diaries suggest this was largely true during the war years. The heart attack did not leave lasting cognitive damage. The pneumonia episodes were serious but acute, leaving Churchill mentally unaffected once the infections cleared. Only the 1953 stroke significantly impaired his mental functioning, and even then, he recovered enough to continue for another 2 years before finally retiring at age 80. The question is not whether Churchill was capable, but whether Parliament and the public should have been allowed to make their own judgment about his capability based on complete information. The tension between security and transparency that characterized Churchill's medical secrecy reflects a broader challenge facing democratic societies during crises. Excessive transparency can genuinely harm security by revealing vulnerabilities to enemies or creating panic among populations already under stress. But excessive secrecy corrodes democratic accountability and allows leaders to escape scrutiny. Finding the right balance requires judgment and good faith, qualities that cannot be guaranteed through formal rules alone. The people who managed information about Churchill's health believed sincerely that they were serving the national interest. They were not motivated by personal gain or partisan advantage, but by conviction that Britain needed Churchill's leadership and that revelation of his medical problems would weaken that leadership without providing countervailing benefits. Whether they were right remains debatable. Britain might have survived and won the war under different leadership. Other capable people existed, but Churchill's unique combination of rhetorical gifts, strategic vision, and symbolic importance arguably made him irreplaceable during certain critical periods, particularly in 1940, when invasion threatened, and in the dark years of 1941 and early 1942, before the tide began to turn. By later in the war, when victory seemed more assured, the argument for secrecy grew weaker, though by then the precedent was established and the patterns set. Consider what might have happened if full disclosure had been mandated. Revelation of the 1941 heart attack could have led to calls for Churchill's resignation at a crucial moment. His replacement might have been Clement Attlee or Anthony Eden, both capable men but lacking Churchill's particular gifts for inspiration and alliance management. Roosevelt and Stalin had built personal relationships with Churchill that affected the conduct of the Grand Alliance. A change in British leadership might have disrupted those relationships at a time when Allied coordination was fragile. German propaganda would have made extensive use of news that the British Prime Minister had suffered a heart attack, portraying it as evidence of Allied weakness and declining British power. Neutral countries weighing whether to maintain neutrality or lean toward one side might have been influenced. These considerations justified secrecy in the eyes of those who made the decisions, and it is difficult to argue conclusively that they were wrong given the stakes involved. Yet there is danger in the precedent. If secrecy is justified in extreme circumstances, those who benefit from secrecy will tend to define circumstances as extreme more often than truly necessary. The machinery of concealment, once established, can be difficult to dismantle. The role of myth in sustaining leadership during crisis deserves acknowledgement. Churchill himself was a master of myth-making, crafting his public image through speeches, writings, and carefully managed appearances. The bulldog determination, the V for victory sign, the cigar and Homburg hat, the growling voice promising blood, toil, tears, and sweat all contributed to a persona that inspired the British people during their most desperate hours. The reality was more complex. Churchill struggled with depression, which he called his black dog. He drank heavily, though apparently without becoming incapacitated. He was often difficult to work with, imperious, demanding, inconsiderate of subordinates. He made strategic mistakes, including the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in the First World War and questionable decisions about Balkan strategy in the Second. His romantic view of the British Empire blinded him to the forces of nationalism and decolonization already stirring. But none of this changes the essential fact that in 1940, when Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, Churchill provided leadership that rallied the nation and prevented surrender. The myth served a purpose, even if it simplified and sanitized reality. Medical secrecy was part of maintaining that myth, ensuring that the public saw an indomitable leader rather than an aging man struggling with heart disease and pneumonia. The question of whether the public should have been allowed to see the reality rather than the myth goes to the heart of democratic theory. Do citizens govern themselves, making informed choices about leaders based on complete information, or do crises justify elite management of information to prevent panic and maintain morale? The British approach during the war leaned heavily toward the latter, reflecting both the dire circumstances and a cultural tradition of deference to authority and trust in established institutions. By contrast, contemporary democratic cultures tend to emphasize transparency and skepticism toward official narratives, though governments still claim the right to withhold information for security reasons. The balance has shifted, but the underlying tension remains. Churchill's medical secrecy looks from one angle like a necessary adaptation to extraordinary circumstances, and from another like a paternalistic withholding of information that citizens needed to make autonomous judgments. Both perspectives capture part of the truth. Lord Moran's complicated legacy reflects these ambiguities. He was a skilled physician who kept an aging patient functioning under immense stress, probably extending Churchill's active life and certainly ensuring that medical crises were managed competently. He made difficult ethical choices, prioritizing what he saw as the national interest over strict medical confidentiality during wartime. He kept detailed records that would eventually inform historical understanding, even while maintaining contemporary secrecy. Yet he violated the trust of his patient by publishing intimate medical details after death, earning condemnation from his professional peers. He participated in the concealment of information from Parliament and public, helping to maintain a fiction that compromised democratic accountability. Defenders see him as a patriot and a historian. Critics see him as a betrayer of professional ethics. Both views have merit. Moran operated in circumstances that did not fit neatly into peacetime ethical frameworks, and his choices reflected genuine moral dilemmas rather than simple right and wrong answers. The impact of Churchill's health on his actual decision-making remains somewhat speculative, because Moran's diaries, while detailed about symptoms and treatments, provide less insight into whether illness affected Churchill's judgment at specific moments. The 1941 heart attack occurred during the Washington visit, where crucial decisions about Allied strategy were being made. Did chest pain and the stress of a cardiac event affect Churchill's negotiating position or his assessment of American proposals? The available evidence suggests not, that Churchill's mental acuity remained intact even while his heart muscle was damaged, but we cannot be certain. The pneumonia episodes in 1943 and 1944 certainly caused periods when Churchill was too ill to work and decisions had to be deferred or made by others. But again, there is little evidence that his judgment when recovered was impaired. The 1953 stroke clearly did affect his functioning, leaving him unable to make decisions for several days and probably slowing his mental processes for months afterward. Yet he continued in office until April 1955. Whether he should have resigned immediately after the stroke is a question that reasonable people can answer differently depending on their views about leadership, accountability, and the specific political circumstances of the time. Reflecting on this entire historical episode reveals how leadership and vulnerability are intertwined in ways that official narratives often obscure. Great leaders are not superhuman. They struggle with illness, fatigue, doubt, and limitation, just as ordinary people do. What distinguishes them is not immunity to such problems, but the ability to continue functioning despite them, to find reserves of will and energy when physical resources are depleted, to maintain focus on crucial objectives even when the body protests. Churchill exemplified this kind of leadership. He pushed himself beyond reasonable limits, accepting the risk to his health because he believed the cause justified it. His doctors enabled this by managing symptoms and crises without forcing him into retirement. His colleagues and staff supported it by covering for his absences and maintaining the machinery of government when he was temporarily incapacitated. The cost was high. Churchill aged visibly during the war years. His health never fully recovered from the accumulated strain. He probably shortened his life by refusing to ease his pace, but he led Britain through existential crisis to victory, and from his perspective, and that of most of his contemporaries, the cost was worth paying. Whether democratic systems should rely on such personal sacrifice remains contentious. An alternative view holds that governance should be sustainable, that institutions should be strong enough to function even when particular leaders are absent or impaired, that personal heroism should not be necessary because structures and processes distribute responsibility among many people. Modern parliamentary democracies have moved somewhat in this direction, with cabinet government, permanent civil services, and clearer succession procedures reducing dependence on any single individual. Yet charismatic leadership still matters, particularly during crises when symbolic unity and inspirational communication become crucial. No institutional structure could have delivered Churchill's speeches or maintained the complex personal diplomacy that held the Grand Alliance together. The challenge is to acknowledge the value of such leadership while also ensuring that one person's incapacity does not paralyze government, and that the public has sufficient information to make informed judgments about whether particular leaders remain fit to serve. The story of Churchill's health and the secrecy surrounding it ultimately offers no simple lessons, but rather illuminates the complexity of democratic governance under stress. It shows how cultural norms, institutional mechanisms, personal relationships, and individual decisions interact to shape what information becomes public and what remains hidden. It demonstrates the power of myth and the limitations of transparency. It reveals the moral dilemmas facing doctors who treat powerful patients and advisors who must balance loyalty to individuals against broader responsibilities. It exposes the tension between wartime necessity and democratic principle, a tension that never disappears entirely, even in peacetime, because governments always claim some right to withhold information for security reasons. And it reminds us that historical understanding evolves as new information becomes available, that the narratives we inherit are often incomplete or misleading, and that pursuing truth requires willingness to question official accounts and look beyond surface appearances. If this deep dive into the hidden history of leadership, illness, and the delicate balance between secrecy and democracy has given you a new perspective on how power really works, then make sure you subscribe right now. There are countless other stories about the gap between public image and private reality, about the decisions made behind closed doors that shaped the world we live in, and about the human beings who carried the weight of history on shoulders that were not nearly as strong as the myths suggest. Hit that subscribe button because understanding how we got here matters for figuring out where we go next, and the next story might change everything you thought you knew.